You will never throw another fabric scrap away after you watch this video. Today I am sharing 18 fabric scrap projects that use all types of scraps, from teeny tiny scraps to leftover binding to a little bit bigger scraps. These are useful projects that you will love. I'll show you some tricky scrap techniques and secrets that will give life to even your tiniest fabric scraps. So if you have a scrap bin full of fabric goodness, let's dump it out and see what we can make with it. Before we get started, I want to tell you about my new bundle, the Quilt Creators Bundle. This is a bundle that includes 2 video courses, a set of printable quilt cheat sheets, and a quilt planner pack. The total value is $342, but right now you can get it for just $79. Click the link in my description for more information. The first project is these fabric coasters. These are made with a super tricky technique that you have to know if you want to use those tiny fabric scraps. First, raid your fabric stash for scraps. You can use any size scraps for this project, including really teeny tiny pieces. We are going to be making 1.5 inch squares. So small pieces, big pieces, any kind. And I like to just kind of choose a color theme. You're going to need an acrylic ruler. I like the ones that start at 0 in the corner and have an easy way to find 1.5 inch. I love my rotating cutting mat, rotary cutter, and reusable interfacing, plus a scrap of quilt batting. We're also going to use spray based for this project. And finally, you'll need a point turner or chopstick. We're going to start by cutting 1.5 inch squares from the fabrics. We need 16 of these for each coaster. If you're cutting from a really small scrap, I like to use my small square rotary cutter. And then for bigger scraps, you can cut strips 1.5 inches wide and then cut them down to smaller squares. Then cut a 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch square from a larger piece of fabric. This will be the back of the coaster. Now I'm going to show you how to piece these together without piecing them individually. So grab a piece of lightweight visible interfacing, and then we're going to put these squares down in a 4x4 grid. The sticky side of your interfacing should be face up. Place the fabric squares face up with the raw edges butting up right against each other. Now use your iron to press down carefully on the grid. We want to press these down just enough to hold them, and then we'll trim the interfacing and continue pressing. Use your rotary cutter to trim off the excess interfacing. Now head back to your iron and press down the squares again just to make sure they're all stuck on the interfacing really well. Now we're going to make our first seam, so fold the first row of squares down and press it with your iron. It should fold easily where the fabrics meet. Now we're going to sew across that fold with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when you open that up, you'll see you just sewed 4 seams all at once. Repeat the process for the other horizontal seams. After you've sewn all 3 of those, we're going to press the seam allowances all to one side. Now we're going to repeat the process with the other seams. These ones will be a bit bulkier because we already have seam allowances in there, so just make sure you press it well to keep it flat. Sew across that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance going right over those other seam allowances. Repeat until you finish all of those seams. Now press those seam allowances all in one direction and then give the whole thing a good press. Now grab your scrap of quilt batting. We're going to spray baste our patchwork to the quilt batting. Make sure you press down really well and then let it dry fully. After it's dry, we're going to top stitch this coaster. I like to top stitch 1/8 inch away from the seams on the side of the fabric that has the seam allowance under it. That way it'll help keep the bulky seam allowance down and it'll just look really good. Top stitch both vertical and horizontal lines, and then we're going to trim off the extra quilt batting. Use a ruler to square up your coaster to 4.5 inches square. Now grab your backing fabric. We are going to do some stay stitching on one side of each of these squares. Stay stitching is just a regular length stitch where your seam allowance is going to be. Since we have to leave an opening in one of the sides, this stay stitching is a little trick to help you get a straight edge when we turn that fabric. Then go ahead and pin the coaster pieces together with the right sides together. Make sure the edges that have the stay stitching are on the same side. Now sew around the edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a 1.5 inch opening on the side with the stay stitching. Clip the corners and trim your seam allowance and then turn right side out. Use a chopstick or point turner to push the corners out. If you still need help getting the corners to be the right shape, use a pin to gently grab that fabric inside the seam and pull it out. Now press your coaster really well and then turn the edges of the opening in. You can use that stitching to help you line up the edges perfectly. Now top stitch around the coaster 1/8 inch from the edges, pivoting at those corners. When you're done with that step, your coaster is finished. You have to try this next scrap project. We are going to make reusable fabric gift bows. These are made with fabric and elastic, and they stretch around your gift, making it a super cute and special way to wrap your present. I love projects that I can use again and again, and these fabric gift bows are so cute. They are set on elastic so you can stretch them around different size gifts, and this is a super special way to finish a present. Grab the templates from the link in the description below, and these are going to be our pieces for the bow. We're going to start with strips 2.5 inches wide and then cut them down to the length of the pattern pieces. We'll need 3 size large, 3 medium, 2 small, and 1 extra small. Give these a good press and then press in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together. Then we're going to sew these all together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to chain piece them so that it's faster and then clip them apart. Now we are going to use a safety pin to clip onto the side of the tube and push through to turn the tube right side out. Repeat until all your tubes are turned right side out and then press well. Now we're going to start creating our little shapes for our bow. So we're going to create a figure 8 shape and then pin in the middle, starting with the largest pieces. Do this for all the pieces except for the smallest one. Now we're going to sew down the middle to keep that figure 8 shape in place and backstitch if you can. Then trim off any of that extra fabric that you see hanging off of your pieces. Now we're going to stack our pieces up to create the bow, starting with the biggest piece and stacking to the smallest. This will kind of create a little snowflake shape, and then just use a hot glue gun to keep these in place as you build your bow. Once you get to that last little piece, you can either sew or glue this into a loop and then put the loop in the center of the bow to finish it off. Check your bow to make sure everything is in place, and if you need to add some more glue, now's a good time to do it. And then grab a piece of fold over elastic. For smaller gifts, I recommend 20 inches. For a larger gift, maybe 36. You can really do any size for this. We're just going to glue this in a circle so that the bow is on an elastic loop, kind of like a really huge headband. And this will be used to just wrap it around your presents. Fabric bookmarks are so easy to make. You only need a few squares for this project, and it's so fun to use. These bookmarks slip right over the corner of your book's pages to hold your spot. This project requires only scraps, and you can use up to 3 different prints for it. You'll need a sturdy, fusible interfacing. I'm using Heat and Bond Craft Extra Firm. And then you can print off the template from my website or use a ruler and a rotary cutter. So the first step is to cut 3 squares that are 4.5 inches wide by 4.5 inches wide. You will also need 2 pieces of interfacing that are the same measurement. We're going to cut 1 1/2 diagonally, so find a longer ruler and cut along the diagonal. We are going to use one of these triangles for the triangle part of the bookmark. So find the fabric that you want to use for that. Then we're going to line up the interfacing at one of the corners of the triangle square and fuse it on. Once you've done that, we're going to press this fabric into a triangle right over that interfacing. So fold up that loose corner up to the top corner. Press well, and then we're going to top stitch on that fold at 1/8 of an inch. Now grab the fabric you want to be on the front of the bookmark underneath the triangle and fuse the square interfacing to it. Now we're going to sew all these pieces together. So put your triangle on top of that main fabric and line it up in the top right corner. Find your backing fabric and put it on that stack. Pin it in place, and now we're going to sew around the square, leaving about 1 inch open on one of the sides that doesn't have the triangle. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then clip the corners and trim the seam allowance down. Turn it right side out, and then we're going to press it really well. Press the bookmark well, making sure to focus on the seam allowance where the opening is. Then top stitch all the way around the bookmark at 1/8 inch. Next, I'm going to show you how to make this lavender sachet. This is a tiny pouch full of dried lavender that you can stick in your gym bag or clothing drawer to keep things smelling fresh. Click the link in my description to get the templates for this. We are going to need 2 colors of fabrics, one for the main and one for the side. Also a funnel for filling it and dried flowers. First, back your fabric with lightweight fusible interfacing. Then we're going to sew the side to the main piece with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Put those pieces together, right sides together, and sew down that side. Now press the seam allowance toward the side piece, and then use your fun stitches to sew along the side piece right along that seam. You can use other stitching or quilting on the rest of this if you want. This is just to give it a little extra fun. Now give that a quick press and then fold it in half, and then we're going to sew this together around the edge, leaving a 1 inch opening on one of the short edges. After you've sewn that, trim the seam allowances, clip the corners, and then turn right side out and press. Before we fill this up, I like to make sure my corners are all turned out really well, and then the opening is pressed under how I want it. So press that under a 1/4 inch to line up with the rest of the side there, and then we're going to fill it up. Use your funnel or a rolled up piece of paper to pour the petals into the sachet until it is as full as you want it. I like to fill it up about 3/4 full. Now just top stitch along that edge to close up the opening, and your sachet is finished. The next project is a DIY sleep mask. This is reversible and uses the softest elastic for the band. Download the sleep mask pattern on my website. You can get the link in the description below. And then we're going to cut out 1 layer with each of our fabrics, 1 layer of lightweight fusible interfacing, and 1 layer of batting. This is reversible, so make sure you pick 2 cute fabrics. We're also going to need fold over elastic. You can also use stretchy lace elastic for this if you have that instead. Cut this down to 14 inches. Now we're going to fuse the interfacing to the back of one of our fabric pieces. And then lay that piece right on top of your batting, lining up all those edges. The right side of your fabric will be facing up. Now grab your template and mark where the elastic goes. There are marks on the sides, and we're going to pin the elastic right on top of that. The elastic is going to be inside our sleep mask as we sew it together. So put the second piece of fabric right side down on top of that, making kind of a sandwich, and then pin all around your sleep mask. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a 1.5 or 2 inch opening at the top of the mask. The top is the straightest part, so that's easiest to close. And then go ahead and trim your seam allowance and clip the corners. I like to use pinking shears. And then you can turn it right side out, making sure to press out all those curves. Focus on the top of the sleep mask, making sure that closure is nice and smooth, and then press and pin that in place. Sew around the mask 1/8 of an inch from the edges to finish. Next, you have to try these fabric trays. You can use all sizes of scraps for these to make different trays for different purposes. The templates on my website include 4 different sizes, so print out whichever size you want. I am going to use the medium tray for this tutorial. Cut out 2 layers on the fold with your pattern piece from 2 different fabrics, and then we'll also need at least 1 layer of interfacing. If you use heavier weight interfacing, use 1 layer. If you're using lightweight, fuse it to both layers. I'm using a medium weight, so I'm just using 1 layer of interfacing, and I'm going to fuse it to the back of one of my pieces. Make sure the sticky side of the interfacing is facing the back of the fabric. The sticky side is a little bit more shiny and has kind of bumps on it. Now place the fabric pieces together with right sides together. Pin, and then we're going to sew around this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to leave a 2 to 3 inch opening on one of the sides. Once you have sewn that, we're going to trim the seam allowance down and then clip the corners. Then turn right side out, making sure the points are sharp, and then press well. Turn under the opening so that it lines up with the rest of the side, and then we're going to top stitch around the square 1/8 inch from the edge. When you top stitch, you'll also close that gap that you left open. The pattern piece is going to help us decide where we sew to make the tray have a base. So we are going to place this on top of our square, and then make sure you're allowing for seam allowance. So the paper should be about 1/4 inch over that fabric. And then we're just going to mark the squares of the inside dashed line. So we're going to mark those corners with a fabric marker. To make this a little easier to see, I like to square off from that dot with my fabric marker, just make the square of the corner. And as you're doing this step, make sure the fabric you want on the outside of your tray is the one that is face up right now. Once you have those 4 points marked, we're going to fold this in half along the diagonal and find that line. So my dot is right here, and I'm going to just draw from the dot up. If you don't have your square, if you didn't do a square, just draw this line really dark, and then that's where we're going to sew. We're going to sew along that line to create that corner, and that'll shape our box. So do that for all of the edges. I like to do these about 2 at a time. Make sure to back stitch 2. And then when you pull your tray out from the sewing machine, you have the cutest little tray. I like to give it a little press and then fill it up. If you have some longer scraps, let's make some scrunchies. These are a classic sewing project that are super easy and fun to make. First, cut a strip of fabric 4 by 19 inches. We're also going to need a safety pin and elastic. I like braided elastic best for this. I didn't have a 1/4 inch braided elastic, so I'm using a thicker one. I also like the soft elastic for more of a soft scrunchie, but the braided elastic will hold your hair better. Cut a piece of elastic about 8 inches long. Now we're going to start assembling the scrunchie by folding the fabric in half with right sides together lengthwise. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to turn this right side out using our safety pin. So clip your safety pin on that crease of the fold, and then use that to thread the fabric through itself. Now press the tube with the seam on the back. Press under a 1/4 inch on one of the short edges. This will give us a nice finish for our scrunchie. So just flip that edge in and fold 1/4 inch down, and then press it to keep it in place. Now we're going to grab our safety pin and clip it to the elastic. Use the safety pin to thread it through the elastic. Once you have both ends, take that safety pin off, and we're going to tie these in a double knot really tight. We want to make sure this is super tight before we tuck it in. Clip off any extra, and then we're going to tuck the elastic into the scrunchie and then overlap the folded edge over the top of the other edge, and then line it up, and we're going to sew this and back stitch. And then your scrunchie is done. Next, I'm going to show you how to make a coin pouch. These are so cute and so little. They're perfect for stashing your coins, and they're really fast to make. Get the link for the templates in the description. For our supplies, we'll need interfacing and 2 different fabrics, one for the main and one for the lining. The pattern piece is pretty small, so you just need little scraps. And then you'll need a zipper at least 5 inches long. We're going to start out by cutting out layers of the coin pouch with both of our fabrics. We'll need 2 of each, so I like to put them all on top of each other, pin that template on, and then cut out 4 layers, 2 of each fabric. Now we're going to fuse the interfacing to the back of the main fabric. Now we're going to start assembly. Lay your zipper with the teeth face down on your main fabric piece, lining up the zipper tape with the top of the fabric. Then put your lining right on top of that, making sure they're aligned at the top of the zipper. Pin the layers together and then we're ready to sew. Use a regular presser foot for this, but align the needle all the way to the left closest to the teeth. After you've sewn it, fold those pieces out of the way so you have access to the other side of the zipper tape. Grab the other main piece and put it face down, lined up right where the other one is at the top of the zipper tape, and put the lining at the back. Pin the layers together and then sew them the same way you did with the first side. Now we're going to top stitch along the edge of the zipper tape. So we're going to fold all the layers out of the way except for one main piece, and then we're going to sew 1/8 inch from that edge of the fabric. Repeat this on the other side too. Now we're ready to start assembly. First, we're going to open the zipper part way, not all the way, but part way so it's in the middle of our pouch. And now we're going to fold the main fabrics on top of each other so that they're facing with the right sides together, and do the same for the lining. Line up all the edges and corners and pin. When you get to the zipper, we're going to pinch that with the zipper teeth facing down toward the lining. Now we're ready to sew. For this zipper pouch, we're only going to sew both of the sides, from the top of the lining down to the main, and then on the other side as well. So we want to backstitch at the ends. Both of the bottoms will be open. Remove your pins, and then we're going to clip off the edges of the zipper. Now we're going to flip the lining fabric onto the main fabric. So we have it inside out, but we can line up those bottom edges. So these bottom edges are open, so we want to line them up along the side seams and the bottom so that they match up. Now pin that bottom edge and sew along the bottom, backstitching at the ends. After you've sewn that, trim your seam allowance down, and if you want to, you can serge or zigzag stitch the bottom seam allowance. The next step is to give the coin pouch some shape. So we're going to go in and pinch those corners, making sure the side seams are straight, and then measure up 3/4 inches perpendicular to that seam and draw a line. Put a few pins in there and then repeat on the other side, and then sew over those lines, making sure to backstitch. After you've sewn those, you can trim the corners off just to get rid of that excess fabric. And then turn the pouch right side out. Your zipper pouch is done and ready to fill up with all your spare change. With germs on the rise, let's sew a hand sanitizer keychain. This is a little keychain that clips to wherever you want it to go. It has a hole at the bottom for your travel size hand sanitizer to dispense out of. You're going to need scraps for the outside fabric backed with interfacing, lining fabric, 1/2 inch bias tape that's single fold, a swivel clip, and cam snaps. You'll also need a way to mark your fabric and quilt basting spray. Use the pattern piece to mark the opening where our hand sanitizer top's going to go. And then we're going to lay the main fabric down on the lining fabric and pin around those markings. Adjust your stitch length down to 2 millimeters and sew around the rectangle, pivoting at the corners. Now grab your scissors and clip into the rectangle, focusing on the corners. Trim off the extra seam allowance and then make sure to clip those corners so we get a really nice straight rectangle. Now we're going to turn this right side out by pushing one layer through that hole so that we get the layers wrong sides together. Give it a good press, focusing on the rectangle. Now you can test it out with your hand sanitizer. Now we're going to finish this straight edge, which will be right here on the hand sanitizer holder. So you can decide which fabric you want on the outside at this point. We are going to fold under these edges 1/4 inch each and press. Make sure they're lined up really well, and then we're going to sew these together with a top stitch. Once that edge is finished, we're going to finish the other side, which will be the top flap. First, fold the pouch so that the rectangle at the bottom matches up and is symmetrical, and then we're going to mark the two sides at the top. These markings are going to show us where to put the bias tape so that we get it all the way around the top flap. So you're going to start putting the bias tape on right over. We're going to sandwich over the 2 layers of fabric, starting about 1/2 inch past that mark. First though, we're going to spray baste this. Spray baste will give it a little stickiness, and that'll help us hold the bias tape as we put it on around that curve. So spray it a little bit, and then we're just going to sandwich those layers of fabric, focusing on keeping that curve nice and smooth. Once you get the bias tape past that other mark, trim it off, and then we're going to top stitch around this real close to the edge of the bias tape. We're almost ready to assemble, but first we need to do the little tab that will hold our swivel clip on. So take your tab piece and fold in the long sides and then press. They should meet in the middle, and then fold them in half again and then top stitch the strip to keep it together. Now we're ready to assemble, so grab your swivel clip and thread it on and fold in half, matching those ends. Then we're going to fold our bag inside out and make sure to match up the bottom rectangle. Pin the sides of the pouch to hold it together, and then before we sew, we're going to stick the keychain swivel tab in. So we want this about 1/2 inch from the top edge of that fabric flap, but we want it to be on the inside of what we're doing right now. So I like to kind of decide where we're going to put it while it's turned inside out, and then pick up that flap and put it right under there and pin. Now we're going to sew from the top flap all the way down on both sides with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure you back stitch really well at the top and the bottom of each of those seams. Next, we're going to pinch the bottom edges, so put your hand into that pouch while it's still inside out. We're just going to make a little bit of dimension by pinching the edge and sewing across it. So perpendicular to your side seam, you're going to want to pinch and create that triangle, and then you can pin it and mark 3/8 inch from the point of the triangle and draw a line across. Repeat on the other side and then sew across those lines, back stitching well. When you're done, you can trim off the extra fabric. Now turn the pouch right side out. The last step is to add a cam snap. So fold your flap over and mark a little spot for the first cam snap. I like to just push that in and then add the backing, and then we'll use this first snap to find the placement for the second. If you've never used cam snaps before, these are super fun and easy to place. Once you have the first one in, fold over the flap again to get the right placement and push down on that cam snap really well so that it leaves a mark where the next one should go. So I like to push it down, find the mark on your fabric, and then use a marker or chalk to mark the point. And with that step, it's done. If you have a dog, you need one of these. This is a dog poop bag dispenser. It's so cute and clips right to your leash, so you always have a dog bag handy. Download the pattern piece on my website and print it off at 100% scale. You can use the 1-inch square to make sure that you have printed it at the correct size. You're going to need fabric scraps, a 5-inch or longer zipper, a swivel hook with a D-ring, and lightweight fusible interfacing. Use your pattern piece to cut out 2 dispenser sides, 2 zipper sides, and 1 little tab. All of these should be backed with interfacing. We're going to start with the zipper side pieces. I like to lay them out how they're going to go on my zipper and then fold them down so that the right sides of the zipper are matching the right side of the fabric. Pin and sew along that edge as close to the zipper teeth as you can with a regular zipper foot. Repeat on the other side. Then press and top stitch close to where the fabric meets the zipper. Now we're going to sew the tab piece. This will hold our swivel clip on. Fold under 1/4 inch on the long edges of the tab and press. Then fold in half to match up the folded edges and press again. Top stitch on both sides of the tab to hold it together. Then slip your D-ring onto the tab and fold over, matching the edges. Pin the swivel to the bottom of the zipper and baste it in place with the edges of the tab hanging over about 1/4 inch from the other fabric. Trim off the excess fabric and zipper tape. Next, we're going to work on the dispenser side. This side has a slit in it for your bags to come through. So take your dispenser side pieces and fold them in half and pressing down on that fold. We just want to make a crease right now. Once they're creased, open them up and pin together with right sides together. Grab your pattern piece and we're going to use this to mark where the dispenser is going to go. So I like to fold it in half. There are lines on that pattern piece and we're just going to mark where the stitching lines end in the middle of the crease on the dispenser pattern pieces. Then use a ruler to connect those. So this is where we're going to sew. Sew down those purple lines, making sure to backstitch. So when you open that up, you'll see that there is a little hole there in the middle of the dispenser, and that is where our bags can come through. To make this stronger, we're going to top stitch around that opening about 1/8 of an inch from the slit. I like to backstitch on the top and bottom edges just to give it a little bit more stability. Now we're ready to assemble. Put the dispenser side face down on the rest of the pouch, and then we're going to line up all the fabric corners. Make sure you open the zipper before you sew this so that we have a way to turn it right side out. And also make sure the swivel tab is facing inside toward the zipper. After you have that sandwich assembled, we're going to sew all the straight edges, leaving the corners open. Trim down the seam allowance and cut off that remaining zipper tape. With the bag still inside out, hold it up and pinch the corners so that they are perpendicular to the side seams. You can kind of just push the bag corner together as shown. Sew across that edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the ends. Repeat that with all 4 corners. Then turn the pouch right side out through the zipper. Now it's ready to fill up with doggy bags and be clipped to a leash. I love this next project because you can use 6 tiny scraps on the top. So save all your favorites for this one. We're going to make a pom-pom pincushion. You'll need interfacing, a pom-pom maker and yarn, and scrap fabric. You can also print off the pattern pieces from my website. Cut 1 hexagon back and 6 triangles. You can use any fabrics for these. We're going to start by sewing the triangles together. You'll notice that the pattern piece has a blunt edge at the bottom. That edge is going to be the center of the pincushion. So lay 2 of the triangles together and sew along that edge, and then press open and add the 3rd. Press well and repeat for the other 3 triangles. Now we're going to sew these 2 pieces together, flip one up onto the other with the right sides together and sew down that seam. Press the seam open on the back. Now we're going to fuse interfacing to the back and the top of this pincushion. Make sure your interfacing is face up with the sticky side up, and just trace around your fabric with scissors. This will get you a really accurate piece of interfacing. You can also use the templates. Fuse to the back of the fabric. Repeat with the pincushion back. Grab the top of the pincushion and your template, and we're going to put this on and just trim off any sides that were a little bit too big. Sometimes this happens when you're piecing fabric, and it's okay, we'll just correct it by trimming. Now put your 2 sides together with right side spacing and pin. Sew around the edge 1/4 inch from the edge, pivoting at each corner and leaving one of those triangles open. After you've sewn it, we're going to trim off the points of that seam allowance and trim down the seam allowance just a little bit. Then flip it right side out using a point turner to help you. Now press it well. When you get to the opening, flip under the fabric to line it up with the edges. Now use fiberfill stuffing to stuff this as much as you want. When you've stuffed it to your liking, grab a needle and thread, and we're going to hand stitch this closed using a ladder stitch. The last step is to add a yarn pom-pom. Use your pom-pom making tool and wrap the yarn around each of the colored sides. Close the pom-pom maker and cut through the yarn as shown. Use a loose piece of yarn to tie the pom-pom strands together. Once you have a double knot, open the pom-pom maker to reveal your pom-pom. You might need to trim it up a little bit, and then we'll use a hand needle to sew it to the top of the pincushion. Now your pincushion is ready to be used. If you have tiny little dolls in your house, you need some doll sleeping bags. These are so fun to make. Find 2 favorite fabric scraps and then print off the template from my website. The link's in the description. We're also going to need a tiny bit of stuffing for the pillow. Cut 2 layers from the sleeping bag pattern. These will be mirror image of each other. Then lay them on top of each other, lining up all the edges. We're going to sew all the way around this pattern piece, leaving this little edge open about 1 inch. This will be the side of our sleeping bag, and we'll close it later. After you've sewn that, clip the corners and trim the edges of the seam allowance. Turn it right side out through your opening. Once you have it turned, give it a good press and fold under the opening edges where you left that hole. Now this part is going to be the pillow, so we're going to stuff a little bit of fiberfill stuffing up there in that pillow through the opening that we left. So push it up and get it out of the way of that pillow, and then we're going to just sew across that line to hold it up there. You can draw a line with a fabric marker if it helps. The last step is to fold over the sleeping bag so that the edges match up like so. We're going to sew across the side and bottom, so pin those in place, and then as we sew, we're going to close the opening. Now your dolls are ready for their sleepover. Next, I'm going to show you how to make a gridded patchwork panel that you can use to make a zipper pouch or really anything. This is a super tricky material that you have to know about if you love sewing with scraps. Of course, we're going to need scraps, and then we're going to need this interfacing. This is grid interfacing. It has a printed 1-inch grid on the interfacing. This will be our trick to getting perfect patchwork, and I'll show you how to use it. You will also need cutting supplies. I love this rotating cutting mat. You can rotate it to get all sides of your fabric. And then you're going to need a pressing mat and an iron. Grab a scrap and we're going to start cutting. First, I like to square off 2 of the edges so that I have a nice clean corner to start with. And then we're going to cut squares and rectangles. The rectangles will be 2 inches by 1 inch, and the squares will be 2 inches by 2 inches. To make cutting faster, you can stack your fabrics and cut multiple layers at once. Stack your scraps, lining them up in a corner, and then cut around your ruler, leaving excess along the edges that aren't even. Then you can rotate around and trim up the other sides to get your perfect squares. We are going to need 30 squares and 30 rectangles. Now cut a piece of your interfacing that'll be big enough for your project. Start with a piece bigger than you expect to account for seam allowances. Now lay this out on your pressing mat and grab a few scraps. Start by lining up a piece in the top corner using the grid to align it perfectly. The grid will help you lay these evenly as you go. Just make sure you're watching where your piece goes on the grid. The grid will help us get even seams even if we don't have perfectly cut squares or rectangles. Continue placing down 2-inch squares until you have 6 in a row. Then we're going to start up with the 2-inch by 1-inch rectangles, creating another column right next to that first one. Then we'll start back up at the top with 2-inch squares again. Continue this pattern until you have enough squares and rectangles down that you can fit your iron on top. It is a little tricky to keep them in place until you have heated them up to activate that fusible interfacing. So get them a little bit hot so you can tack them on there, and then continue your pattern until you've used up all your squares. If your pieces happen to overlap a tiny bit or even have space in between them, it's going to be okay because we do have a 1/4-inch seam allowance for some extra give. So don't worry if there is a little extra space or overlap. Once you have finished using all of those scraps, we're going to give it another press and then trim around the edges. Now press again with your iron to make sure the edge pieces are secure. Flip it around to the back and press again from the back to get a really good press. Now we're going to start sewing. We're going to use this grid and the intersections along our rows to create the patchwork really quickly. So the first step is to fold along one of those rows or columns and press along where the fabric meets. Where the fabric meets will easily fold over, and then I just like to press it to hold it a little bit extra while I am sewing. Then go ahead and bring it to your sewing machine and sew down that folded edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This interfacing is allowing us to sew 6 seams all at once. Press that seam allowance and then go on to the next intersection. You can start with either vertical or horizontal, but just make sure you're doing all of the rows in the same direction first before starting with the perpendicular seams. Once you have done all of that, give it a good press. You're going to see that all of my vertical seams are done, so we'll start doing the perpendicular seams. Before starting on the horizontal rows, turn the panel over and clip the seam allowances at the intersection. This will help us reduce the bulk of the seam allowances, especially since the interfacing is already making them extra bulky. After you clip them, we're going to press the seam allowances of each row in opposite directions. So leave the first row with the seam allowances pressed down and then press the second row up. This way, when we fold our rows to start sewing our horizontal seams, half of the seam allowance will go one way and half will go the other. That way we won't have 4 layers of fabric under one part of our patchwork. So you'll see when you fold up at the next intersection, the seam allowances are going in opposite directions, which will reduce our bulk. So now take it to your sewing machine and sew those horizontal seams. Pull that out from your sewing machine and you can see how perfect this patchwork is turning out. Continue sewing those horizontal rows until you have finished them all. Now press all the seam allowances in the same direction and then your patchwork panel is finished. This is a gorgeous piece of fabric that you can use to make any project. I used mine to make this zipper pouch I'm so thrilled about, but really the possibilities are endless. Here's another pincushion project. This is a mason jar pincushion. It only uses a tiny scrap of fabric and it's so fun because the top screws off and you have a canister for storage. You can use any size mason jar for this. If you're using a regular size, use the small template. There's also a wide mouth template. We need interfacing, fabric, and some ribbon is optional, and fiber fill stuffing for this project. I love cluster fiber fill stuffing. First, fuse interfacing to the back of your fabric, and then we're going to cut out 1 layer from the template. Sew around the circle about 1/4 inch from the edge with a base stitch, and then grab your lid to your mason jar and pull those stitches around until the size of the fabric matches the size of the metal. Use a glue gun to carefully glue that on to the metal lid. Use sewing clips to hold the fabric on as it dries. Keep gluing until you get close to where you started, but leave an opening for stuffing. Grab some fiber fill stuffing and stuff this pincushion to your liking. Once it's done, glue the remaining piece of fabric on there to hold all that stuffing in. Be careful not to burn your fingers. Now put just a little bit of glue in the ring of the mason jar around that edge and shove the pincushion in and tighten it around your jar until it's dry. Now you have a pincushion on top and a container inside for holding all your little sewing supplies. This makes such a great gift. You can give them to college students or anyone who needs a sewing kit on the go. This next scrap project is a tissue holder. This is so fun to make because the top layers overlap to create the opening for your tissues to come out. Click the link in the description below to download this template or use the measurements 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches. You're also going to need a little piece of ribbon and fabric scraps. We are going to start by picking out 6 different fabrics and giving them a little bit of a press so that they are nice and ready for us to cut with our template. I love having a template for this because you can make sure that your scrap is big enough without having to measure. You can see that I'm lining these layers of fabric up at the top left. That way I can cut these out multiple layers at a time. Once you've cut out all 6 layers, choose 2 for the lining and the backing of your tissue holder, and the other 4 will go on the top of our tissue holder. Now we're going to press 2 of these rectangles lengthwise, So fold them in half, meet the long sides together and press. And then with the other two, we are going to fold them in half the other way, so crosswise, and press. Now we're going to start assembling the tissue holder. First, take your ribbon and cut about 4 or 5 inches to create a loop. And then we're going to set this aside. We'll slip it in there later. Now grab your 2 unfolded pieces. We're going to decide which is going to be the lining and which will be the back of the tissue holder. So whichever one you want to be the back, lay face up. And then the one you want to be the lining will be face down on the table. So these will be wrong sides together. Now we're going to create kind of a woven stack of the folded pieces around the tissue holder. The folded edges are going to be facing into the middle of the pouch. And at this last one, I'm just picking up that last piece to get, we have an over, under kind of pattern. And in the middle, this will be where the opening is, because all those edges come together, they're not going to be sewn. So once you have that little setup, we're just going to make sure all the edges are lined up and go ahead and pin it. When you get to one of the short edges, grab your loop and we're going to put this inside of that little pouch so you see the raw edges coming out. And just pin that in there. This loop is great if you want to attach a keychain, hardware, or a swivel hook to it. So I like to lay the edges flat like that. I'm going to cover it up and just make sure all those edges are right where they should be again. Once you have that nice and pinned, we're going to sew around the entire rectangle with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We don't need to leave an opening on this project because in the center where all the folds meet, we have an opening where we can turn our pouch. Now we are going to clip the corners of this pouch and trim off the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch. And then if you want to, this is an optional step, you can finish the edges of the pouch. I am using pinking shears, which are a zigzaggy scissor that will help from fraying. You can also do a zigzag stitch, use fray check, or just leave it. So now our pouch is coming together. I'm going to turn it right side out just so you can kind of see what it looks like. It is so cute, and you can use it like this, but I'm going to show you how to make the edges a little bit boxy. This will help give it that perfect shape for the tissue holder. With the pouch inside out, slip your fingers into that corner in this inside and pinch the corner so you have a little triangle that is perpendicular to the seam allowance. And now I'm just going to put 2 little pins in there to hold that, and then sew across that about 1/2 inch from the point of the triangle. And I always like to backstitch at least once, usually twice. And that will give us that really nice little shape. It just gives a little dimension to the pouch. Now trim that seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch and then repeat on the other 3 corners. Now turn your tissue holder right side out and then open up those folds, and you can stick a mini travel tissue pack right inside of there. These are perfect for sniffle season. I am going to stash this one in my car. You can also add a keychain and put it on a backpack. These are excellent stocking stuffers and great gifts for friends. This next project is a placemat that I made with my leftover binding strips. I have a bin that I put all my extra binding strips in. I always use the same width, 2.5 inches. So these are already cut and ready for me to use for a project. You can also cut your own strips for this project or use a jelly roll, which comes with pre-cut 2.5 inch strips. I am just going to take these to the sewing machine and start sewing. I'm not going to plan it out too much. We are going to sew these together and create a gorgeous striped placemat. So I am making sure the strips are at least 13 inches long and then sewing them together. For this project, I prefer to just start sewing and make sure that they're longer than 13 inches. You can cut them 13 inches first before sewing together, but I like to have it a little extra on there. I feel like it gives me a nicer edge and a nicer finish, and we'll trim it down later. So I am just chain piecing these strips together, making sure before I sew them that they are 13 inches long. Once you have sewn 4 sets together, grab another strip and add it to one of your sets of 2. We need a total of 9 strips for this project. Once you have 3 sets of 2 and 1 set of 3, we're going to sew all 4 of these sets together I like to make sure the top edge is mostly lined up, and that's where I'm going to sew them together. And we are just going to keep doing that until we have a panel of 9 strips that are more than 13 inches long. Once that is done, bring it over to your pressing mat. We're going to press all the seam allowances in the same direction. I'm pressing mine all to the right side. Once you have a nice flat panel, bring it over to your cutting space. We're going to trim up the top of the placemat, and then we're going to cut this down to 13 inches, and then it should be about 18.5 inches wide. If it's a little bit off, that's okay, but we'd want to just trim up all the edges so that it's nice and squared off. And then if your fabric on the short edges has skewed, you're also going to want to just trim that down. Make sure you have a nice flat straight edge. Now our panel is ready to be made into a placemat, so grab a piece of quilt batting. And then we're going to lay our panel on that batting and baste it with a spray baste. This is a sticky adhesive, is a temporary bond that will allow us to top stitch these pieces together. I like to start in the middle and kind of work my way out, pressing really gently. And then peel up the other side and stick that on. Now grab a piece of backing fabric. You can either use yardage or another large scrap, or you can do another panel and back it with a second panel of strips. I'm using just this big piece of fabric, so I am going to put that face down on my table and then put my batting and panel face up, and then just spray baste that together as well. Once you've done that, pat it down, and now we're going to let this sit for a couple minutes, maybe 10 or 20 minutes. We just want that spray base to set and not be tacky. Now we're going to top stitch along these strips right where the seam allowance is. So I pressed it to one side, and I'm going to sew on top of the side with the seam allowance under it. This will give it a nice sturdy finish, and it is just going to be gorgeous with those stitching lines. Keep top stitching until you've finished all the lines. I am just doing one line on each strip, but you can do on either side of the seam if you want. Now our panel is finished and ready to be turned into a placemat, so I am just going to trim off all the excess backing and batting, making sure I'm squaring that up again. We still want it to be about 13 inches by 18.5. But if you find you need to make it 12.5 inches by 18, that's fine. This is still going to be a good size placemat. Now grab some more 2.5-inch strips. We're going to bind this just like we would bind a quilt. I found extra strips in my bin, so I'm going to use these to bind it. They're different colors, and I love that scrappy different look, so I'm going to use a pink and a purple. I'm going to put them together. So to join binding strips, put the edges together like this, and then we're going to sew across that diagonal. I like to use a fabric marker to draw a line across that diagonal and then pin it in place so I don't lose the placement. After you've sewn that, trimmed off the excess fabric, leaving about 1/4 inch as a seam allowance, and then go ahead and press that seam allowance open, and then press your binding in half. Now we're going to sew this on just like we would a quilt binding. So if you have never done this before, just pick a spot, any spot, leave about 5 or 7 inches of binding on one edge, and we're going to start pinning this. Start sewing it on with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you are going to sew all the way into the corner until you're 3/8 inch from the edge. So you can either mark a little dot or just eye it. And then you'll pull your project out and fold the binding over like this. So you're going to make a triangle and a square, and then line it up again with the edge, and then just start sewing right at the top 3/8 inch from that side edge. Once you get close to where you started, you're going to leave probably about 5 to 7 inches, and then we're going to grab our binding strips. We want to make these overlap exactly the width of the binding strip. So my binding strip is 2.5 inches, so I want these to overlap 2.5 inches. Now we're going to sew these two edges together the same way we did when we were sewing the binding strips together. So we are going to put the two edges together and sew along the diagonal. This gets a little tricky because it's tight in there, so if you need to undo some of your stitches, that's totally fine. Once you have that sewn, you can trim off the excess fabric, press that open, and press your binding down again. Now just finish sewing that binding on using the same seam allowance. Once the binding is sewn onto the front, you can flip it over to the back and use a hand needle and thread and attach it to the back with a slip stitch. When you get to the corner, you are just going to fold that into a little triangle. I like to use my needle to kind of push the fabric down to create that angle, and then continue attaching that binding. Once you're done, tie it off and your placemat is all done. This project is also reversible, so make sure you pick something gorgeous for the back. This next project is a great way to make some decor for your sewing room or Christmas ornaments. This embroidery hoop ornament features a quilt block and is so fun because it uses the teeny tiniest scraps. This can be used as wall decor for your sewing room or tie a string on top, and we're going to put this on our Christmas tree. This project uses what some quilters call crumb scraps, or pieces smaller than an inch. There is a free template on my website. Click the link in the description below to get this. And this is designed for a 4-inch mini embroidery hoop. You'll also need string if you plan to hang this, interfacing, and heat and bond. So grab some tiny scraps. We're going to start by backing a scrap with heat and bond. Make sure you have the sticky side down on your fabric when you are pressing it. Once it's cool, peel off the backing and you will see the heat and bond right on that fabric. And now we're going to use the templates to cut out the pieces of the quilt block. So you're going to cut 8 triangles with one fabric and 1 center square with another fabric. Once you've done that, we are going to cut out a circle of fabric and back it with interfacing. The template will be the right size for this. And then I like to use the template to bind my placement. So we want this centered in the middle of the circle. So find that placement and then press it to adhere the heat and bond to that circle. And now we're going to add the little triangles. This is a sawtooth block, so I'm just putting the triangles on each side just like this, and then I'm going to press them again to hold. Once you are done with that, you can give it a final press, and then if you want to, you can just go ahead and put this in your hoop, or you can give it some top stitching. I love the top stitching just because I love the stitchy look. So it gets a little tricky, but you can do about 1/8 of an inch all around each of those little pieces. Now we're going to open up our embroidery hoop and put this in. This will be like our little frame. So grab the inner circle and center your fabric on it. And then we're just going to put that top circle right on top and push it down. Tighten that up and then trim off the extra fabric around the back. Now if you want to hang this up on a tree, you can grab some baker's twine and just tie that around the metal hardware at the top. These are perfect for any quilter in your life. Here's another pincushion project. This one has steel wool inside to sharpen your pins when you put them in, and it's the cutest little hedgehog design. Start off by printing off the templates from my website. You can find the link in the description below. You'll also need to collect fabric for the face and the body. Lightweight fusible interfacing to give the hedgehog a little bit of structure. Scraps of quilt batting. Superfine steel wool. If you're shopping for this, look for the 4 zeros. And then you'll need an embroidery floss and a needle. This will be for the eye. You'll also need a fabric marker and not pictured spray-based and regular filling. We're going to start by fusing the interfacing to the back of the main fabric. Make sure the adhesive side of the interfacing is down and then press well. Now we're going to fold the fabric in half and cut out 2 layers of the hedgehog body piece. We want to cut this on folded fabric so we get 2 opposite pieces or mirror image of each other. Now we're going to fuse interfacing to the back of the face fabric. Fuse 2 layers of interfacing on this piece. We need extra stability on this piece since we're going to embroider an eye. Now cut out 2 layers just like you did with the body piece. They should be mirror image of each other. Use a fabric marker to draw in that little sleepy eye on both sides. Thread the embroidery needle and tie a knot at the end of your thread. We are going to embroider the eye with a back stitch. The back stitch starts about a stitch length away from where you want the line to start, so put your needle in through the back and then go back to the start of the eye. Pull that down, and then we're going to do that again. So notice where the needle's going in. It's going in about 2 or 3 millimeters ahead of that stitch and then going back to meet it. Continue embroidering that eye until you're finished and then tie it off on the back. Repeat on the other side of the face. Now we're going to attach the face to the body. So take your face and put it right side down on the hedgehog's body. You want the hedgehog's face piece to go over the hedgehog body at the bottom just a little bit. That way when our stitching line comes in at 1/4 inch, it'll be matched up. Pin that in place and then sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Repeat on both sides. Now press the face open with the seam allowance pointed toward the body of the hedgehog. Top stitch along that body piece about 1/8 of an inch from that seam. Now we're going to spray baste the hedgehog to a layer of batting. Spray it on the batting to get it tacky and then push your hedgehog down carefully. Trim around the hedgehog to get rid of the excess batting and repeat with the other side. Once you have your 2 pieces ready, we're going to lay them on top of each other with right sides together and line up all those little spikes and all the curved edges. Now sew all the way around this, leaving an opening at the back edge right here behind the foot. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance or even a little tiny bit less, and then go in with your scissors and trim out all the in-between points between those spikes and the top of the spikes and the curves. Now you're going to turn it right side out. This is actually the hardest part of the project just because your hole's so little and your fabric is thick, but use a chopstick and then press as you go. Once your little guy is turned right side out, use regular fiber fill stuffing to stuff the head and the spikes of the hedgehog. Use a chopstick to move that around, and then we're going to put the steel wool in the belly of the hedgehog. I don't really like the feel of this, so I'm using a glove, but I don't think you really need to. It's not sharp, it's just really feels like wool. So we're going to stuff that in. You can just tear pieces off and push it in with your chopstick until you have enough in there. Steel wool is really dense, so it'll take a little bit more than you think to get it in there. But once you have enough, you can finish off your hedgehog with some more fiber fill, especially if your spikes aren't as stuffed as you want them. The last step is to hand sew the hedgehog closed at the opening that you left. Press those seam allowances in and pin it in place, and then use a ladder stitch to finish closing it. Once you finish that step, your hedgehog is done and ready to sharpen all your dull pins and needles. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video inspired you to save your scraps. For more scrap projects, click the video above.